Hello everyone and welcome back to the MTG Novels Project episode 11. Today we are doing our final reading out of The Colors of Magic edited by Jess Lebow. However, I want to give a quick shout out first to Coach at the Card Bazaar YouTube for the idea and inspiration. Check the comments for links to his audiobooks for the first 3 novels. Full disclosure, I had a speech impediment earlier in life which I've tried my best to overcome. I also apologize if you find my voice nasally or otherwise dislike it. I'm trying my best to provide you with the best content I'm able to provide. However, this being said, I'd love to hear constructive feedback which corrects pronunciation issues or provides other realistic feedback that could improve the project. A legal note. This is an unofficial audiobook with original content belonging to Wizards of the Coast. This content is covered under the 2017 Wizards of the Coast fan content policy. Listener discretion is advised. Our story today is The Gold Border, in brackets, Loran's Smile, by Grubb. Loran died 10 years after the devastation, after Urza and Mishra destroyed most of the world with their war. After a tumultuous explosion that eliminated Argoth and altered the rest of the world forever, Loran died in part because of that devastation. She did not die in battle, for she was not a warrior, nor did she die in a duel of magical forces. For though her lover, Felden, had mastered the study of magic, she found she could not. She did not die of intrigue, or of passion, or of some fatal flaw. She died in bed, weakened by wounds suffered over a decade previous. Wounds inflicted by Ashnod the Uncaring, Mishra's assistant. She was weakened by the lengthening winters and the cold mountain air, weakened by her own great age, weakened and eventually defeated by the world that the brothers Urza and Mishra had created. At first she just winded easily when in the garden or cooking, and Felden would put aside his own work to help. Then she had trouble working in the garden at all, and Felden did the best he could, under her direction, to substitute for her. Later she could not work around the house, and Felden brought in servants from nearby towns to aid. When she could not get out of bed, Felden sat beside her and read to her stories of his own youth, and listened to hers. After a time, he had to feed her as well. At length, she died in bed, in her sleep. Felden sitting beside her, asleep as well from his long guardianship. When he awoke, her flesh was cold and pale, and the breath had long since left her body. He commanded the servants to dig a grave behind the house, among the now weed-choked garden that Loran had begun with Felden's grudging, grumbling, and aid shortly after they first arrived. She had kept it going through several seasons by sheer force of will, but when she took ill that last final time, she had to surrender the garden to the weeds and the cold rains. It was raining when they laid her to rest, wrapped in her bedsheets and sealed within a coffin of thick oak planks. Felden and the servants uttered a few prayers. Then the old mage watched as the servants methodically piled the dirt atop the lid. Felden's tears were lost in the rain. For days afterward, Felden stayed by the fire, and the servants brought him his meals, much as they had Loran hers. Felden's library and workshop stood empty for the nonce, the books closed, the forges cold, the various reagents and solutions sitting quietly in their gas jars. He stared into the fire and sighed. Felden remembered the touch of Loran's hand, the Argivian lisp to her voice, and her thick, dark hair. Most of all, he remembered the smile that she gave. It was slightly sad, slightly knowing smile. It was a soft smile, and it waned whenever Felden saw it. Now Felden was a practitioner of the third path, the way that was neither Urza nor Mishra, charting a new course between the two warring brothers and their technological miracles. He could pull from his mind great magics, fueled by the memories of his mountain home, and work wonders with them. He could cause fire to appear, or land itself to shift, or summon the strokes of a lightning storm, and bend them to his will. Yet he could not heal Loran's body or dying spirit. He could not keep the life within her. His magic had failed him, had failed his love. The old man sighed and raised a hand towards the fire. He unlocked a part of his brain that held the memories of the mountain around them. He pulled the energies from those lands as he learned to do in Teresia City with Drafna, Hercule, the Archimantrite, and the other mages of the Ivory Tower. He concentrated in the flames' rise as they rose from the logs, twisted upon themselves until they finally formed a soft smile. Loran's smile. It was the most he could do. For 5 days and 5 nights Felden sat by the fire, and for a brief time the servants wondered if they would soon have to tend the master, as they did for the mistress. Indeed, Felden was never fully healthy himself. Overweight and walking only with the aid of a silver cane he had rescued from the heart of a great glacier. His dark beard was now streaked with silver, and the corner of his eyes drooped from grief and age. The surgeons wondered if he would ever rise from the fireside again. On the 6th day, Felden retreated from the hearth to his workshop. Soon afterwards, a small note appeared for the servants, a list of items that they were to procure as soon as possible. The list called for thin sheets of copper, iron rivets, cords made from various spun metals, brass gears if they could get them, steel otherwise, glass blown into a variety of shapes with illustrations and dimensions. There's a letter to be delivered to a place far south and west. For the next 2 months the workshop clattered. Felden brought the forge to life, and the small anvil rang with ear-splitting blows. Fire was within the domain of mountain magics, and Felden was its master. He had caused it to heat a precise location with the exact amount of heat needed merely by ordering it to do so. Such was the nature of the old mage's magic. The wire arrived in the gears, iron, not brass, sheets of copper and some of bronze. The glass was substandard, and Felden had to resort to teaching himself how to blow it to form the shapes he needed. More wire arrived. This new amount spun from horsehair to form thick, long cords like braids of human hair. At the end of the 2 months, Felden looked at his work and shook his head. The joints were stiff, and the arms jutted in the wrong direction. The head was too large, and the hair looked like what it was, a collection of wire and horsehair. The eyes were little more than badly crafted glass spheres. It was too tall at the shoulders and too large at the hips. The creation looked nothing like Loran. Only around the mouth, where there was a ghost of a smile, came the hint of a memory. Felden shook his head, and thick tears gathered at the corner of his eyes. He took a sledge and knocked the automaton to pieces, and he began again. He pored over Loran's journal in the library. She had studied Urza with himself, and knew something of artifice. He restrung the wires and ligatures throughout the arms and legs, building first miniature models, then full-fledged mock-ups before proceeding to the final version. He worked in animal bone and wood, as well as metal and stone. His glasswork became better, so he could provide a glass eye for an old woman in the village that matched her good one. Slowly he built the automaton in the shape of Loran, sculpting her out of a myriad of materials. After 6 months she was finished. The statue missed only the heart. Felden waited patiently for that organ to appear. He spent his days in the workshop polishing, testing, and rebuilding the automaton. When he first met Loran, she had use of both arms. Later, she lost use of one, crippled by Ashnod. He went back and forth, removing and replacing the arm. Finally, he restored the statue to its complete state. A month later, a package arrived from a place far to the south and west, from a scholar whom Loran and Felden had known when they were at Teresia City at the Ivory Towers. The package contained a small chip of crystal, glowing softly, a power stone, the heart of artifice. There are fewer and fewer stones of this type, in the years since its devastation, but this was one. The package contained his note as well. Signed by Drafna, master of the school of Latlam. It said simply, I understand. Felden held the power stone and noticed that his fingers were trembling. Cradling the crystal in both hands, he went to the automaton, standing guard in the center of the workshop. He had placed the bracket for the crystal where the heart would be in a living woman. Selden set the crystal within its framework and closed the compartment door. He reached behind the automaton's left ear and touched a small switch. The automaton jerked to life like a puppet whose strings had suddenly been pulled. Its head shook, then cocked slightly one side then the other. One leg tense and the other relaxed. One shoulder dipped slightly. Felden nodded and raised a hand, pointing to the far side of the room. The tauntaun in the shape of Loran walked gingerly, like a woman finding her land legs after a long sea voyage. But by the time she had reached the end of the workshop, she was walking normally. She reached the opposite side and turned and walked back. She smiled, hidden wiles rippling the lips over her ivory teeth. The smile was perfect. Felden smiled back, the first time he had truly smiled since Loran had left him. Every day the tauntaun stood patiently in his workshop. He talked to it, but had to point to command it. For the first month it was enough. But it was silent, save for the high-pitched whirring of gears and wire spooling and unspooling. At first Felden thought he could live with it, but after the first month it became an irritant. After the second it was insufferable. The silence, its metallic lips crafted into that perfect smile, was more than he could bear. It seemed to mock him, to taunt him. He asked it questions and reprimanded from himself, for he knew it could not answer. The Lord he had built was a creature of copper skin and geared muscle. It was not the woman he had loved. At last, he reached behind her ear and touched a small toggle, deactivating her. She stiffened as the power left her, though the smile remained on her lips. He removed the power stone from her heart, set the stone on the shelf, and placed the inactive tauntaun in the garden, sitting guard over Loran's grave. Within a week, the steel gears had rested solid, locking it forever in its stance. The glass eyes seeing not only the recording the world around it. In the week that followed, Felden returned to the far side, staring into the flickering flames as if they held some secret. At the end of the week, under cold rain, he departed, leaving his servants to keep up the house in his absence. He left the town in a small wagon, heading eastward into the lands most affected by the devastation of the Brothers' War. As he traveled, he asked questions. Did anybody know of mages, of spellcasters, of individuals with wondrous magic? Before the destruction of the Ivory Tower, there had been many who had explored the path's magic, but they'd been scattered when Teresia City had fallen. Surely some had survived somewhere. He asked merchants and mendicants, farmers and priests. Some looked at him if he were mad, and some were frightened, terrified they were seeking to bring back the powers that created devastation in the first place. But enough understood what he was looking for, and those, a few, knew of his wise man, or that shaman who walked the third path. In time, he heard of a hedge wizard, and he turned his wagon to the east. He found the hedge wizard near the wreckage that would have been Sereneth, one of the great cities that had resisted Mishra and was destroyed for its sin. Most of the great forests in that land had been later lumbered and its mountains stripped to feed the war machines of the Brothers' War. Now it was a barren landscape, its soil runneled and ravined by eternal rain. What forests that survived were overrun by tangles of briars and young trees. In one of those briar-choked shambles, Felden found a hermit. The man had defended his patch of ground from Mishra's army, and the strain had nearly broken both his mind and his spirit. He was a hunched figure, bent nearly double with age, with a drooling grin and a cackling laugh. Felden approached with one open hands, showing he was weaponless. The hermit had heard of the council mages at Teresia City, and had known of Felden's name among them. He laughed and capered, and allowed Felden to come within his forest to study the hermit's magics. Felden offered to teach the hermit his own spells in return, but the hunched madman would have nothing to do with the mountains or their power. Instead, he taught Felden of the woods, and they crossed and recrossed his small domain, which he had held so laboriously against the invaders. Over the course of the next month, Felden felt he knew the land as well as the old hermit. They spoke of many things, of plants, of trees, and of the seasons. The hermit felt the world was getting colder beyond his borders, and Felden agreed. It seemed to him the glaciers of his home were swelling slightly with every passing year. Finally, they spoke of magic. Felden showed his power, summoning images from the flames of birds, mythical dragons, and finally, a simple knowing smile. When Felden had finished, the hermit cackled and nodded. The madman stood, arms folded in front of him. Felden started to say something, but the hermit held out a hand to quiet him. For a moment there was silence in the forest. Then there was a noise, or rather a sensation, a rumbling that pounded through the ground and into Felden's bones. The ground quaked beneath his feet, and the campfire collapsed on itself from the shuddering ground. Felden cried out despite himself, but the hermit did not move. Then the worm appeared. It was a great and ancient creature, as large as one of Mitra's dragon engines of old. The scales were golden and green. It had baleful red eyes that glimmered in the dark. It loomed above them in an instant and was gone. A wall of scales surged past them, the worm's elongated body hurtling before them. After a long time, the worm's whip-like tail spun out, smashing the trees like a lion pulled away from a runaway wagon. The ground stopped shaking. The old hermit turned and bowed deeply. Felden returned the bow and understood how the ancient maid had kept his patch of forest for all these years. Carefully, Felden outlined his problem. He had lost someone dear to him, and his old magic lacked the power to restore him. Did the power of the hermit hold more? The old hermit rocked back on his heels and grinned. Is this one who is dear still alive? He asked. Felden shook his head, and the hermit grin faded. He too shook his head. I can only summon living. That is the power of the growing briar. Perhaps I can send you to someone who might have the power you seek. Felden left the hermit's forest the next day, heading north. Rawnelm Lake bordered the lands of Sereneth, and the lake had fared as badly as the land. Where once there was an expanse of white beaches, now only leprous grey moss flourished, and the lake itself was little more than the wild expanses of stagnant, oily water, broken by pungent algae blooms in greasy shades of green and red. Felden guided his small wagon along the perimeter of the lake. The hermit said he would recognize the sign when he reached the domain of the sorceress who ruled part of the shore. Indeed he did. The grey moss began to fade, and at last retreated fully, leaving only a cascade of white sand as pure as any Felden had any seen. It was broken at the shore by a thin line of round black stones, themselves smoothed by the rolling surf. Felden took a breath and smelled the fresh spray, without a tinge of musty fog. He found her at the foot of the crystalline waterfall, in a small pavilion that seemed to be spun from golden threads. She was taller than he, dressed in a shimmering robe that looked like a translucent rainbow. She granted him an audience, as muscular servants brought a simple meal of cheese and dried apples. The provender seemed insufficient for such opulent surroundings, but Felden said nothing, and accepted the sorceress's hospitality. She asked him his quest, and he told her. He sought to regain a love that had been lost. She nodded, and a tight smile appeared on her face. Such matters have a price, she said. Felden bowed his head and asked her to name the price. Stories, she said. You must tell me the stories of Loran, so I may better grant your wish. Slowly, Felden began to tell the tale. He recounted what he knew of Loran from her own tales and her journals, of her life in the Far East, in the distant lands of Argive, of her early life with the brothers, and how she eventually rejected their war to seek another path. She spoke of how she came to Teresia City and joined a band of scholars looking for the path that included Feldon. He stumbled a few times, but the sorcerer said nothing. He told of how the two met, how they studied together, and how they had fallen in love. He explained how they had separated when Misha attacked their city, and what had happened to Loran at Ashnod's hands. She seemed to heal slowly in their time together before sprawling downwards into an eventual death. As he spoke, he halted fewer times, and his mind was alive with her memory. He recalled her black hair, her lithe figure, her touch, her smile, always that knowing smile. He spoke of how she had died, and what he had done afterward. He recounted his construction of an automaton, and his trips to the hermit, and now his visit to her. As he spoke, he forgot the sorceress was there. Loran was alive for him. At last he came to the end of the tale and looked at the enchantress. Her face was impassive, but a single tear trickled down her cheek. I rule in the sea and the sky, she said, much as you rule in the mountains, and the hermit, the growing vegetation. You have paid my price with the story. Now let me see what I can do. She shut her eyes, and for a moment it seemed that outside the golden pavilion the sun passed behind a cloud. Then it brightened again, and Loran stood before Feldon. She was young again, and whole. Her black hair shimmered like a dark waterfall. She smiled that knowing smile, secretive smile she always had for him. Feldon rose and reached out to embrace her. His hand passed through her like smoke. The relief in his heart was replaced with fire, and he turned toward the sorceress. She had risen from her divan now, and held her hands up as if to ward off a blow. She isn't real, cried Feldon, spitting out the words. I rule in the blue, said the sorceress, and blue is the stuff of air and water, of mind and imagination. I cannot bring back what is gone, only create its image. If you want her truly back, you must seek another. Who is this other? Asked Feldon, and the sorceress hesitated. Again, Feldon asked, Who is this other? The sorceress looked at him with cold, crystalline eyes. There's a swamp further north. He who lives there rules in the black. He can bring back what you seek, but we warned. And her voice softened. His price is higher than mine. Another tear appeared on the sorceress's cheek. Feldon bowed, and the enchantress offered him her hand, which the old man kissed. While the sorceress's flesh appeared young and supple, to Feldon's lips it felt leathery and ancient. He reboarded his wagon and continued. A short distance beyond the golden pavilion he dismounted on a pristine white beach, and felt the ground. It looked like pure white sand, but felt like rocks covered with grey moss. Feldon gave an understanding grunt and set out for the swamp. Here, along the northern borders of the Ronam Lake, there had been a village. But the land of the village had settled, or the lake had risen, so that it was nothing more than a collection of buildings rotting in a ruined swamp. Great dark birds hovered through the arc-rooted trees. No, Feldon corrected himself. Bats. They were bats, which no longer feared the light in this land of eternal gloom. The village had a rough, rotting palisade, little more than a collection of sharpened logs driven into the muck. The guards at the gates were sallow, hollow-eyed men, dressed in tattered armor. They threatened Feldon with capture, but he summoned fires in a great wall between him and them. After the guards stepped back from the flames, and after a quick consultation with the other, they chose to escort Feldon to their master. Their master was an aged spider of a man, who received his visitors on a throne carved from a gigantic skull. Feldon thought briefly of the great worm that the Green Hermit had summoned, and wondered if the fleshless skull before him was of the same type. The ruler of the swamp was short, pot-bellied and bald, and slouched in a corner of the throne as Feldon explained his quest. He had lost someone dear, said Feldon, and was told that the master could find a way to return her. The man gave a watery, choking laugh. I am the master of black magic's redling, he said. I know the powers of life and death. Are you willing to pay my price? And your price is, asked Feldon. The master stroked his hairless chin. I want your walking stick. Feldon gripped his silver cane tightly. I cannot part with it. I pulled it from a glacier many years ago. It is like part of me. Ah, said the master, and your love is such a pale, insubstantial thing that you cannot part with a hunk of metal for it. Feldon looked at the twisted spider of the man, then his rune-carved cane. He held it out. Your price is met. Excellent, hissed the master of the swamp, taking the cane. Let us begin. For 3 days and 3 nights, Feldon studied at the feet of the master. He memorized the marshes around the village, and felt the thick, viscous pull of the land in his mind. It was very different from the cold, clear mountains that he normally used. It left him feeling soiled and unclean. At the end of the 3rd day, the hollow-eyed guards escorted Feldon to a small, windowless hut at the edge of the village, just within the walls of the palisade. Here, Feldon worked the spell that the master of the swamp gave him. In the light of a single tallow candle, Felden cleared his mind and meditated. Normally, he would think of the mountains, but now he thought of the bogs around him. He felt their watery pull, sucking him down, embracing him with their power. He spoke the words of spellcraft and called forth Loran. The candle flickered for a moment, scattering Felden's shadow behind him on the wall. Far above him, the wind coursed through the mangrove branches and sounded as if the lake itself had built a great wave to swallow the village. Everything grew quiet. There was a sound of footsteps outside. They moved slowly and ploddingly, the thick mud pulling at the heavy feet as the sound approached. It was the sound of a figure staggering and sloshing through the muck. For a moment, Felden's heart leaped. Had he succeeded? Something heavy and wet thumped against the door, sounding like a bag of wet earth. Slowly, Felden pulled himself to his feet. He no longer had his cane, and shuffled to the door. The door gave another sloshing thud, then another, as Felden reached it and grasped the nod. The stench hit him. It was moldering, heavy smell, of rotting flesh and damp earth. It was the smell of death. Felden's heart sank as he realized what he had done with the master of the swamp spell. There was another thump and the door shifted, but Felden was leaning against it now, seeking now to keep up whatever was on the far side. He did not want to see if the spell had succeeded. He did not want to know. There was another thud and a gurgling cry that sounded like sloshing water. Felden's heart shuddered as he reached inside himself and willed the spell to end, to send whatever was behind the door back to wherever it had come. The smell of death was gone, and with it the sounds. Felden stayed pressed against the door, holding it shut with all his might until morning. When morning came, he slowly opened the door. There was no footprints in the muck outside the door. Indeed, the entire village had been abandoned. There was no hollow-eyed guards, no master of the swamp. Nothing called his name in a gurgling voice like sloshing water. Felden staggered to his wagon, pausing only to use a piece of black driftwood as a makeshift walking stick. He did not look back. In time, as he traveled, the ground began to rise and dry. He had circumnavigated the lake now, and all that was left to him was to return home. He dreaded that, for fear of what he would find in the garden. It was 3 days from his village when he heard of a scholar in a small town further west. Propelled in part by curiosity, in part by dread, Felden turned his wagon westward. He found the scholar in the musty remains of a temple library. The building had been shattered long ago by an earthquake, and the snows and rain had rotted most of the books. Yet, among the tattered remains of books and scrolls, the scholar hopped like a bird shaped a tom-tom. He was a spindly thing, and regarded Felden from behind thick lenses of crystal. Felden spoke of his tale and of his loss, of his resolve to regain what he had lost. He told of the hermit, the sorceress, and the master of the swamp. When he finished his story, the scholar blinked at him through heavy lenses. "What do you want?" he sighed at last. Felden let out an exaggerated sigh. "I want to have Loran back. If magic can do everything, why can't it not do this?" "Of course it can do this," said the scholar. "The question is, do you want it to?" Now it was Felden's turn to blink, and the scholar gave him a thin, amused smile. "Green calls to the living," he said. "Black calls to the dead. Blue creates a shadow of life. Red consumes. And that's very important as well, because you often must destroy before you can build. I study, and the magic I wield is white, which is the magic of comprehension and understanding." "Can you bring her back to life?" asked Felden, his voice catching. The memory of the swamp was still with him. "No, I can't," said the scholar, and despite himself, Felden sighed in relief. "But I can help you to create an exact duplicate." "I tried that with the tom-tom," said Felden. "I speak of a creation not of gears and wires, but of magic," replied the scholar, "identical in every way." "I don't understand," said Felden. "When you cast a spell using fire," explained the scholar, "I believe you do not create fire. Rather, you take the magical energy and form it into the shape of fire, which then does your bidding. It is for all intents and purposes fire, but is made of magic." But what about when I use fire? Asked Felden. Or when the hermit calls a great worm? Scholar waved his hand. Different uses for the same tools. Yes, in those cases it is real fire and a real worm. But the magic alters it for the moment. Assume that you create something made of magical energy. Felden thought about it and nodded slowly. So if you study an object, you can create the object over time, said the scholar. Again, Felden nodded. If you study me, he said, you'd be studying that which makes me a scholar. Therefore, you could call later time that part of me which is scholarliness and rely on its advice. Felden shook his head. I'm not sure I understand. Study me for 2 weeks, said the scholar, and see if you understand. Don't talk to me. Just bring me my meals. 2 weeks. That's my price. That, and later you have to let me and the other scholars into your library. Is it a bargain? For the next 2 weeks, Felden brought the scholars meals, in much the same way he had brought Loran hers when she was bedridden. Felden used his magic to keep a small flame going and to cook for the scholar, as he pawed through the rotting texts and decaying scrolls of the ruined temple. For the first 2 days, the scholar seemed little more than an amusing bird, hopping from one location to another. But soon Felden noticed there was a method in the madness, that there was intent behind each of the scholar's movement. He began to see how the man thought, and knew, through it all. The scholar ignored him, save at meal times. At the end of the 2 weeks, the little man turned to Felden and said, Summon me. Felden shook his head. Pardon, he said. You had watched me for 2 weeks, said the scholars. Now see if you can turn your magic to bring me into being. Felden blinks. But you're already here. So bring another me, said the scholar. You've got the power. Use it. Felden took a deep breath and called upon the power of the land. He thought of the nervous scholar in his thick spectacles, rummaging relentlessly through the decaying paper and rotting vellum. He tried to call a being that summed up the nature of the creature in one place. There was a pause, thus an identical duplicate of the scholar appeared. No doubt identical, it was taller, and its flesh had a ruddier hue, but it was thin and nervous, had thick spectacles and a knowing manner. The scholar, the real one, walked up to the crane being, and looked over his glasses at it. The duplicate did the same. Felden was amazed. Is it real? He choked out at last. The scholar reached out and touched the quasi-duplicate, and the quasi-duplicate touched back. Feels like it, said the scholar. A lot of the little details are wrong, but you aren't just summoning me. You're summoning the essence of me-ness as a scholar. You can keep this around by keeping that part of your mind aware of me. But it isn't. Me, that is. Felden worked his way around the scholar's thinking process. But what can I do with this you? What would you expect a scholar to do? Returned the bespectacled man. Research, investigate, know certain things. In a slightly more evasive voice he added, but I wouldn't know anything about fighting or lands I never visited, or anything like that. It would be beyond my nature as a scholar. And I could do the same with Loran? Asked Felden. Both scholars nodded. Felden found the duplication unnerving, and dismissed the part of the spell that held the magical scholar in place. He faded from view like snow in the rain. You can summon your lost love back, said the scholar, if that's what you truly want. Felden thought about the scholar's words on the way back to his home. The wagon shuttled through the deep ruts of the road. It was rain again by the time he returned. The servants had kindled a fire in the hearth. Before he entered the house, he checked Loran's grave. Beneath the inert, rusting form of the tauntaun, the earth was undisturbed, and that made him feel slightly better. He thanked the servants and returned to his workshop. There, among the tables draped with cloth and reagents, settled into multicolored layers into their beakers. He allowed himself to remember. He remembered Loran, not just the feel of her touch or the way her hair moved like the dark waterfall. He remembered her, when she was happy, when she was angry, when she was gardening, when she was dying. Felden thought of Loran and the life she spent with him, the tales of her youth and her work and lives together, the joy of his life with her and the sadness of her departure, feeling like a great bubble rising without him. He fed his memories of the land into that bubble, memories of the mountains, the forest, and the shores, the swamp and the temple. He filled it with power and life. When Felden opened his eyes, Loran was there. She was perfect and whole, as young as she was when they first met in Tracer City. She gave him a knowing smile and said, "Why am I here?" "You died," said Felden, his voice choking as he spoke. She nodded and said, "I seem to remember that. Why am I here?" "You're here because I missed you," said Felden. "I missed you and well," replied the spell Loran, and she reached out to him. Despite himself, Felden shrank from her embrace. She paused and said, "What's wrong?" "You're not her," he said at last. "No, I'm not," she said in her voice, in the lilting Argivian accent he remembered. "We both know that, and you know that I could be nothing less than you remember of her. You remember her as of being honest and strong. I am the sum of her, taken through your feelings. I am what you remember. You are memories," sighed Felden. "And though you are pleasant memories, I must leave you as memories. If you are here, you're more than the automaton in the garden. Unliving, an imitation of what she was. I'm sorry. I went to much trouble to bring you about, but I know I can't keep you." "Then why am I here?" she said. "You are here," said Felden, taking a deep breath, "so I can say goodbye." The spell lord paused and smiled slightly. "I understand," she said at last. Felden crossed to her and embraced her. She felt very much like the Loran he had known. All that was Loran in his memories was encased in a spell creature he had created. When they parted, there were tears in both their eyes. "Goodbye," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Goodbye," she replied. Felden allowed the spell to elapse, and the form of Loran began to dissolve. "I understand," he said to her vanishing form. At last, I think I understand." All that was left was a knowing smile. Then that was gone as well. Felden returned to the work in his library and the workshop, taking up small matters that had been abandoned ages ago. In a few weeks the scholar appeared at Felden's doorstep, and amused to see that save for the servants, Felden was alone. After a meal, the bird-like scholar asked, "What became of your lost love?" "She was lost," said Felden with a deep sigh, "and it was beyond my power to bring her back. It was beyond my desire, but I had a chance to say goodbye." "That is what you truly wanted?" asked the scholar. "That is what I truly wanted," said Felden. The scholar spent 3 weeks in Felden libraries and then left. He promised to send interested students to the Grizzard Man's home. Every so often, a would-be scholar or mage would appear, and Feldman remembered his promise, and would let the wizard go to the library. Over dinner, he would tell his own story of what he had learned about magic. Sometimes the aspiring mage would listen politely, sometimes intently. Occasionally, after everyone had gone to bed, a mage would creep down and find Felden sitting by the fire. The flames twisted into a form of a smile, a soft, knowing smile, and Felden, the ancient wizard, seemed to be content. So that was our last story in the Color of Magic anthology, The Golden Border, Loran's Smile, by Jeff Grubb. Thanks for listening, and next time we'll start a novel, Planeswalker.